we have Aaron Miller is going to be the moderator of the first program this morning. And Brian Ross, the Vice President of Renewable Energy Great Plains Institute, is going to be our speaker. So we're looking forward to that, and thank you for your kind attention, and we'll be keeping you posted as things go along today. But let's get rolling. Take it away, Aaron.
All right, good morning, everybody. Glad to see so many people here on this cool, brisk Nebraska morning. Welcome to our session, Budget Reconciliation and Changing Administration, the Impacts of Renewable Energy on Development. Like John said, I'm Aaron Miller. I'm the Energy Planning and Resources Supervisor with the Department of Water, Energy, and Environment. And yeah, it's great to see so many people here, like I said, for this important discussion on how national policy, market forces, and local decision-making continue to shape the future of renewable energy development across the Midwest and beyond. This session will unpack how federal policy shifts from the Inflation Reduction Act to potential rollbacks under new leadership are influencing project pipelines, tax incentives, and community-level opportunities. We'll also explore what these changes mean for developers, utilities, and local governments trying to balance energy goals with economics and land use priorities. Our speaker today is Brian Ross. He's the Vice President at the Great Plains Institute, where he leads GPI's Renewable Energy and Communities programs. Brian brings over 30 years of experience working with local, regional, and state governments on climate energy planning, renewable energy policy, and land use. He's a national leader in integrating renewable energy with community co-benefits, supporting agriculture, and aligning clean energy projects with local priorities. GPI's work spans all major emission sectors: electricity, industry, transportation, buildings, and agriculture, and is rooted in collaboration and practical solutions that drive both economic growth and carbon reduction. Please join me in welcoming Brian Ross.
My clicker here. Okay. Well, good morning. So thanks for coming, and I have to admit that I'm Midwestern born and bred, but I haven't actually been in Nebraska for a while. So it's a really pleasure to come through and see all the people here who are actually working on renewable energy and kind of bringing this industry forward. So I'm really glad to be here. Glad you invited me, and I'm going to be talking today about this state of the industry in our federal, actually, and state and local flux that we're seeing from the standpoint of policy, of programs, of funding, and of markets. And they asked me to talk about the budget reconciliation and the BBB, and I'm going to. I said, look, if you want somebody to talk about what the details are of 48E in the tax code, that's not me. You know, I'm not the person to do that. But rather to talk about the overall impacts of that. And I was thinking that they would say, okay, we'll find someone else. And they said, no, that's what we wanted to talk about. So I had to come to Nebraska then. So that was okay. But so if you're expecting to hear the details of 45C and 48E of the tax code, you're going to be disappointed, but hopefully that's something that you aren't here to look at. But I do also always start my presentations with my conclusions. So that if some point in this talk you kind of lose track of what I'm saying, that maybe all you have to really do is remember the things that I have on this slide, or if I put you to sleep. So I just want to go over these things a little bit. Kind of these are the conclusions really that we work with when we kind of work with energy stakeholders, and that I specifically work with on my renewable energy work that we do at Great Plains Institute. And the things to keep in mind are that the underlying economic conditions, in spite of all the federal policy, haven't changed significantly, haven't changed meaningfully for renewable energy. And that the underlying economic conditions of renewable energy development really is very favorable relative to other energy resources. And that we have, in fact, in our nation, startlingly abundant renewable energy resources for the tapping. Second, I just want to emphasize that despite some of the things we're hearing recently about renewable energy and kind of the rhetoric that's been put forward, the issue of reliability, which has kind of raised its head again in regard to renewable energy fairly recently, is actually one that we don't have to worry about. There are multiple pathways to a high penetration renewable system, clean energy system that is highly reliable in its nature, and we need to not get distracted by the kind of reliability issues that come up, and to stick to the kind of economics that we have moving forward. And then finally, and this is kind of the pitch part of what we say, we've been hearing a lot recently also about kind of the rising energy costs. And really, everybody is seeing increases in electricity prices across the nation, from the Midwest out to the coast. And the thing to keep in mind in the industry we're talking about here, in the renewable energy industry, is that our accelerated investment in renewables and in the kind of technologies that are coming forward that support renewable energy industry, things like storage and transmission, distributed energy resources, all those things really are the key to unlocking reduced energy prices. And this is something that we need to put forward as a kind of industry in putting forward renewable energy, is that this is the way that we move forward, not to a hard future, but to an abundant future to reflect our abundant resources. So I'll talk a little bit about the elements of those kind of moving forward. But I will start with kind of a discussion about kind of what the context that we're looking at in terms of the federal regulation and the current administration's tack toward renewable energy. The budget reconciliation bill has kind of been the focus point for a lot of the industry, because that is the place where the law was changed, right, and the things like all those tax credits were modified or rescinded. But it all started really on the first day of the Trump administration. One of the very first things that happened was an executive order was issued titled "Unleashing American Energy." And I actually thought, when I first saw the title, I was like, oh, well, this is a good thing, right? And we're going to unleash that energy. And I even like the way the very first sentence of it started, which is, Section 1, the background: America is blessed with an abundance of energy and natural resources. Because this is something that is really a positive statement. We are blessed with all these resources, and if this is the way we're going to move forward, kind of in a policy framework, that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. But of course, the context that was made by the administration in this is that they were really looking at what they called traditional energy resources, which I've always characterized them as conventional energy resources, because I don't think that we should be looking at our resources as a matter of tradition. If we looked at traditional resources as a guidepost, we'd still be heating with wood. But nevertheless, it was the kind of thing that we see here, the mine mouth coal plant and the kind of coal reserves and the energy reserves that we see in our conventional energy system, the kind of things that have gone into centralized power plants, and our large-scale transmission system, where we had centralized resources, and most of the country were consumers that were being served by a few communities that were hosting the energy system. And the kind of nature of this question of abundant resources is rooted really in the concept of, when you get into it, of what our energy reserves are. And I kind of wanted to put this definition up here. This is the Security and Exchange Commission definition of what a proved oil and gas resource is. And this is a slide that I actually showed to a lot of the communities I talked to kind of help them understand what an energy reserve is. And and they say, well, why are, that energy reserves is a physical thing. Why are you showing us the Security and Exchange Commission definition? Well, it's because that's the intersection of physical science and economics. We have people who are companies that are putting reserves on their books as assets and then buying and selling stock, and the Security and Exchange Commission wants to be able to identify clearly what is an economic resource and what is not. And so this is kind of an important thing, and I'll run through this and emphasize a few of these words. So what is approved oil and gas reserve? And of course this applies equally to other conventional energy reserves such as coal. But those quantities of oil and gas which by analysis of geoscience and engineering data, so we got an analysis there of the data, can be estimated with reasonable certainty, okay, so it's not fixed, it's reasonable certainty, to be economically producible. Okay, so there's the concept of a reserve has to be something that's demonstrated to be cost effective, really. From a given date forward, from known reserves, under existing economic conditions, not future economic conditions, and operating methods and government regulations. And so this is kind of the definition of what those energy resources are that the Unleashing American Energy executive order was really talking about. It's like these are the things that we've looked at historically, and the things that they wanted to emphasize in forward-going policy. And okay, there we go. And it was really kind of the kind of things that we see, and this is an example of I'm from Minnesota. This is an example of a very largest coal plant in the state, Sherco coal plant. I think it's about, at its peak was about 2,000 megawatts worth of capacity, burning primarily coal. And this is what the Unleashing American Energy concept was all about these kinds of resources. And the interesting thing, this was a picture taken a few years ago, and the nature kind of changing and evolving markets and what that means in regard to energy resources, kind of this is what the plant looks like now. So the plant is being in fact scaled down, and it's 750 megawatts worth of solar is going in, as well as they're building a transmission line to connect it to some wind energy further away. The concept of tradition versus what makes economic sense is something that we need to think about in terms of our overall energy reserves in our country. And we have seen this similar thing kind of around other conventional energy resources, and this is actually an interesting case. This is a nuclear plant that is, in this picture, shut down. It was uneconomic. It was, I think this is in Iowa. And today, this is what it looks like. Which again is the kind of evolution of what we think of as our energy reserves and our abundance of energy and natural resources that we have in our country. I will also note that this particular nuclear plant is actually probably going to be restarted because things again have evolved and changed. But part of what that we want to get to in this concept of abundance and a concept of what are our nation's energy reserves goes to that definition that I talked to earlier about evolving conditions, existing market conditions, what is reasonably economically producible. Those things change. They're not fixed in time. What was our oil and gas reserves 50 years ago did not include, for instance, things out of the Bakken oil field up in North Dakota, because the economics of extracting that were so high as to not be viable, and so it wasn't actually included in our what we would call our approved oil and gas reserves. It wasn't that we didn't know it wasn't there. The geologists knew that the shale oil was there and that it was a very large resource, but until the technologies were developed, things like directional drilling and fracking systems, it wasn't economic. And it also had to be, of course, it became economic when the prices of conventional energy, oil and gas reserves increased to the point where suddenly it was accessible and economic to do. So the nature of what our energy reserves are and what our American energy system is evolving over time in response to market conditions, in response to changes in technology, and in response to our energy needs. And so one of the things that we do when we talk to communities about this is we try to get them to understand energy reserves in the context of things like solar and wind. So we rewrote the SEC definition slightly to apply it to solar energy. So what is a solar energy reserve? Everybody knows what an oil and gas reserve is. They have a sense, but what is a solar energy reserve? Well, those quantities of solar energy, which by analysis of atmospheric and land cover data, can be estimated with reasonable certainty to be economically producible from a given date forward with known access to direct sunlight under existing economic conditions, operating methods, and government regulations. So the words are almost identical to what we would see in the oil and gas reserve definition, and we can apply this with equal certainty and with equal economic analysis to something like solar energy or wind energy. And we've actually, we did some analysis with communities using some of the LIDAR data that was available at the state level to analyze what those energy reserves are. And we were working with cities in this case. So what we did was we looked at what we called their rooftop solar energy reserve. And we actually calculated it for them. And what we discovered in most cases, you can see a picture here of kind of the LIDAR analysis, which looked at where the economic solar energies system opportunities were on rooftops. And we added it all up across the city. And what we would typically find, we did this for a number of cities, is that older, kind of more dense and economically, cities with a lot of industrial energy use, we would see something like 30% of that city's electric energy usage could be met with the rooftop energy reserve. Now, of course, we know that not every single rooftop is ever going to be developed. That's the nature of a reserve, right? You talk about what the reserve is. Not all of it will ever be pumped out or used. But the 30% number is actually the low end, because when we started looking at some of our bedroom communities that were primarily residential, we actually saw rooftop reserves that equaled 100% of their annual electric energy use in that community. And that just puts a data point on what you can potentially achieve and what kind of goals you can set as a community in terms of your energy resources. We also did the same thing with solar and in terms of the non-rooftop reserves, but it kind of became an absurd exercise because the size of the resource was so huge that it didn't make sense to people. And it also would have required, of course, putting solar panels and things like that in places that they didn't want to see in their community. But the National Renewable Energy Lab has, of course, done this quite extensively in terms of documenting both wind resources and solar resources. They don't call it reserves. They tend to call it technical potential analyses. But the magnitude of those resources as measured under this kind of a definition, the resources that can, with reasonable certainty, be economically producible are so vast that we can't possibly ever tap it, and we wouldn't want to tap it because we wouldn't have the demand for it under any kind of forecast of energy load moving forward. So the question of what our energy resources are, what are we really needing to unleash, if we look at things like the technical analysis, the economic analysis, and the existing economic conditions, are really about the renewable energy system. So unleashing American energy is really about unleashing renewable energy. And this is something that we can carry forward, and we need to take into our economic analyses when we kind of look at this stuff. So that having been said, kind of the question of what is the abundance of our natural resources in our country and where our opportunities are, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the nuances of of the federal regulation. And we look at this and go over the analysis that we've seen, and we see both headwinds and tailwinds looking forward for the industry at this point in time. So some of those things that relate directly to the federal efforts, some of this is out of the reconciliation bill, and some of this is actually other actions that have been taken in support of that executive order that was titled Unleashing American Energy. We have seen, of course, the elimination of tax credits for a range of renewable energy projects, mostly looking forward. Exclusively looking forward, but kind of looking at the projects that were planned and online for coming into the pipeline, either in the near term or over the next 6 or 7 years. Those tax credits have been eliminated, and we've seen a lot of dropping off of projects leaving the ISO queues and having to be restructured or eliminated. We've also seen some new permit barriers that have been put in place at the federal level, specifically targeted at renewable energy projects, which is kind of, it isn't that they are trying to help restore the coal industry or the oil and gas industry. It's that they want to diminish the renewable energy industry by erecting new permit barriers at the federal level. And this is something that we've seen, and there's people in this room who do development and could speak to this with far more detail than I can. But the kinds of things where there used to be fairly streamlined permit processes that have been put in place for federal permits that have been changed, but only changed for renewable energy. And so we've seen this kind of strange permit barrier that has been put in place, and additional red tape that has been erected and that companies have to go through. We've also seen, of course, cancellation or revision of federal permits where those permits have been already put into place, both for renewable energy and for some of the infrastructure projects like transmission. And then, of course, tariffs that have been put in place that were not necessarily directed at renewable energy, but interestingly affect the entire supply chain of most energy systems. So the whole economic question of how much it costs to develop any kind of energy in this country now, and the time frames that we're looking at, have changed not just for renewables, but for all energy technologies. We've also seen, in the sense of some of the other actions taken, cancellations of signed contracts and programs that were designed to support the expansion of renewable energy markets, and I'll touch on this in a second. But things that were designed, for instance, to overcome market barriers at the community level, for instance, in low-income households or with communities that are specifically affected by the energy transition in terms of supporting investment in those communities, that is renewable investment, that wouldn't necessarily have been economic otherwise. Some of those contracts and programs at the federal level that were created in the Biden administration and signed by the Biden administration have been canceled. There's also been a number of modifications to programs and contracts in order to de-emphasize the use of renewable energy resources. And then one of the things, of course, that in a rural state like Nebraska, and something we also see in my home state of Minnesota, the REAP program has been significantly changed and new barriers are put in place. And this is an established program that has been through multiple presidential administrations and has been fairly successful, but it has suddenly been changed. And it hasn't been eliminated, but it's kind of additional red tape has been put in place and limitations about how you can use it, particularly as it affects our rural communities. There have been a number of cancellations of programs and contracts that were designed to affect emerging technologies. One of the big successes of policy has been the renewable energy industry, the wind and solar industry, which 30 years ago was not economic yet and was just starting to get its legs. But there were policies in place to actually to encourage that emerging technology of wind energy at the time, or in 15 years later. Same thing happening with solar. When I started doing work back on solar back in probably about 20 years ago, and at that point in time, I used to stand up and talk about once we get to scale, we're going to see dramatic declines in in the cost of solar energy, and it's going to become an economic resource. And I would tell people all this, and we would show them the forecast that National Renewable Energy Lab had done about scale and about cost reductions. And I would always think, boy, what are they going to think if this doesn't actually happen? Because I didn't know it was going to happen. But it was forecast to reach, solar energy was forecast to reach what we call grid parity by somewhere around 2020, and in fact it reached it 3 years earlier in 2017, and so we were in fact justified, and the policy work that had been done to create those emerging technologies and make them economic actually worked. And the Biden administration was doing similar things with technologies, both in terms of kind of manufacturing technologies as well as things like hydrogen, right, there was a big federal investment that was being made. All those have been canceled. We just saw a big cancellation a couple of days ago of a lot of battery emerging technologies that were being supported and factories being built that now don't have those, the contracts that they thought they had signed and that were solid. And then finally, there's been a cancellation of research projects really designed to address the question of social license. And this is an ongoing problem with renewable energy in our communities, a space that I work in quite a bit, that we lack that social license to build for renewable energy. But there are solutions to that, and there's a lot of work, including some things that we were doing, that also have been canceled. Now, not everything is bad in federal policy. There are a few tailwinds, and I just wanted to kind of point those out as well. There was, in spite of the initial attempts, the ultimate pathway for existing projects and projects that are in the pipeline leaves open the door for many of those projects to continue to receive the tax incentives, and the economic basis upon which they were designed and are being built is still solid. In fact, most of the developers that I've talked to have said that they have enough projects in the pipeline that they think they can keep going, that they aren't overly concerned about the effect of the tax incentives immediately. It's more the farther out projects that they have to revise, and the financial pro formas no longer work for. So there are some pathways for continued renewable energy development moving ahead, provided they meet the standards of that they've been set forward by the IRS under the current administration. There is continued tax incentive available, the ability for some key technologies such as battery storage. This was something that was originally slated to be eliminated, but in fact ended up being retained, so that the policy of providing and encouraging the development of this industry is in fact still in place, and we're going to see continued probably significant growth in the application of that, and in the technology of battery energy storage being deployed across the nation. There are other tax incentives for other energy technologies that have been retained in place. So all of those 45Q, 45E kind of tax code numbers are still in place, and it still apply to a number of technologies. Great Plains Institute works across all the technologies, and so we actually have seen some of the work in those other technologies in order to develop a broad portfolio of energy resources are still in place. And then finally, support for for industrial and technology expansion is strong and in place. We see this most prominently, of course, in the kind of explosion of data centers, right, that we're seeing across the nation, and support for those kinds of investments. Now, to call that a tailwind for renewable energy is maybe it requires a line to be drawn, but really the increasing resource need from these expanding industrial technologies is something that is most easily met by renewable energy, and that's something I'm going to talk about in just a second. Some of the other tailwinds, though, that really go more to economics rather than federal policy, and this is one of the first points I made, is that the underlying market conditions for renewable energy remain unchanged. Right, the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy for renewable energy, is the lowest of all the energy technologies and generation. That is not dependent on federal policy. That is an economic reality. It's going to continue to be the lowest moving forward. LCOE as an indicator has taken some hits recently by people who don't like the results that it gives. And it's not a perfect indicator, but it is the kind of primary indicator we use for kind of what is the most economic form of technology and the most economic way to generate electricity in our nation. Second, the speed of deployment for renewable energy continues to favor wind and solar over other kinds of resources. And ironically, this is partially a result of things like the tariffs that have been put in place, where the lead time for a gas turbine, to install a gas turbine, is something like 8 to 10 years out. And this is in spite of the headwinds that we see on renewable energy, on permitting and deployment there, it is still faster than almost any other energy technology. And when we couple that with the increase in load that we're seeing from things like data centers, what that means is that load is going to most easily be met in terms of building new capacity by renewable energy, even under the current economic conditions. Expansion of energy storage is really critical. Energy storage doesn't generate energy, right? It only stores it, and it is most economically effective when you use it with energy resources that have low marginal costs. Well, what is renewable energy? I harken back to early in my days. I went to go hear a presenter on solar energy talk and trying to convince people that solar energy made sense. And he would give his sales pitch, and he always ended with, "and free fuel delivered every day." And that's something that continues to be true, right? Low marginal costs. The cost of generating the next kilowatt hour of electricity from a solar energy system that's already in place is zero. And that's something that is going to really be that energy storage and continuing investment in energy storage is really going to support. And then finally, we have a whole lot of investment in emerging grid technologies that really has the potential to unleash American energy and clean energy system. Things like grid enhancing technologies, which are going to have the potential to transform our transmission system. We have things at the distributed energy system at the distribution level that similarly are going to really benefit even distributed energy, things like grid forming inverters and grid forming battery systems that allow for even distributed energy to be the backbone of a system and support it from a reliability standpoint. So we have that rising energy demand kind of that is going to continue to go forward in time, and we see some significant changes here, kind of broken down by the Energy Administration looking over the last 6 years, and the average annual growth of load in these different sectors, 2.6, 2.1% after 15 years, probably before that, of seeing growth rates less than 1% or even approaching zero, is something that's going to continue over time, and that the markets to meet that load are going to continue to select renewables. Despite obstacles, renewables have the shortest timeline and most direct pathway to adding capacity, and these new large loads that we're seeing, including things like data centers, are contracting directly for large-scale renewables development. A lot of the PPAs that have been signed over the last 10 years have actually been corporate PPAs rather than utility PPAs. So this is something that actually is going to continue to drive demand for renewable energy. I do want to kind of touch on a couple other issues, one being reliability, another one being impact on rates. Reliability is something that has come up recently. Part of the work that the current administration is doing with the DOE is talking about things like this. Secretary Wright issued an emergency order back in August to basically try to keep these traditional traditional conventional energy systems in place to minimize the risk of power outages and address grid security issues. And he noted in the quote there, it's going to ensure millions of Americans can continue to access affordable and reliable and secure baseload power regardless of whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. And this reminded me of a kind of thing that I've encountered many times throughout my career in renewable energy, is that imagine yourself, you're at a gathering, you're at a party of some kind, and somebody says, you meet someone and they say, what do you do? And you say, I work in renewable energy. And you talk a little bit about what they do. And then they look at you and they say, ah, yes, but what happens when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow? And they ask that question as if they just laid down a four of a kind over your full house and trumped you. So, the irony here is that the question, what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, is actually a very good question. It's not a good question if it's asked rhetorically, as if it's the answer. And that's the way, unfortunately, that we're hearing kind of our current administration portray this, is like the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow sometimes, therefore. And in fact, it's a good question. What does happen when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? Well, we have things like energy storage. This is the most economic for the lowest forms of marginal cost production, forms of generation. Wind and solar energy resources are abundant at a magnitude that dwarfs most of the even most aggressive forecasts of energy demand, and certainly any form of other kind of energy. The mere abundance of this wind and solar resource gives us, coupled with things like energy storage, an answer to this question about what happens when the sun isn't actually shining and the wind isn't blowing. Wind and solar resource and generation availability is actually highly predictable. It's not usually a surprise to people who have built solar energy systems that night comes. We've actually documented pretty well when it occurs. We have some predictability about that, and we can plan for it. And similarly now with in the wind industry, we have great predictability about when those wind, on a day-ahead basis, which is the way that the transmission system and our wholesale grid works, is when it's going to be available. And then finally, statement that talks about when wind and solar is not available, there's a presumption behind that is that our conventional energy systems don't have that problem. And that's not true. We have conventional energy systems have always had outage times. They've always had planned outages. They've had unplanned outages. We have a reserve margin that is required to be maintained by utilities and that is administered by our independent system operators where they are at, and things like the Southwest Power Pool. And that reserve margin wasn't invented for renewables. It is in place already. And so the answer, and that already solves a lot of our problem. Because if you have a reserve margin, you can use it when you need it. And it doesn't matter if you only need it 1% of the time, or if you need it 20% of the time. If it's there, you can use it. And that's the quick answer that I always give when someone says, what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, is I say, well, in the electric system, the same thing happens as when 1,000 megawatts of coal plant goes down because the turbine exploded and is out for 18 months, which actually happened in Minnesota back a few years ago. That plant that I showed earlier, Sherco, one of their big turbines went down unexpectedly. It flew apart. It had an engineering flaw. It was out for 18 months. 1,000 megawatts of power. The system didn't crash. The system actually barely saw a blip in price because we had a reserve margin. And so when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, from a reliability standpoint, what does that mean? It means that we have things in place already that can fix that. Now that's going to need, as we increase the amount of renewables we put on the system, the concept of what a reserve margin is probably going to evolve. But we don't have a problem from a reliability standpoint. And this is something that is a misconception that people have about the renewable energy industry. And this is the kinds of things that we talk about when we talk to communities about the renewable system, in trying to help with the social license issue, that as we look at the clean energy future, every one of these projects that we build is in a community someplace. And the energy system of the past, we had a few places that were the host communities, and the rest of us were consumers. On a forward-going basis, every community is a host community in the clean energy future. Because every community in the United States, every single one, has an economically viable local energy resource. And this is why we talk about things like solar and reserves and wind reserves. Every single community has an economically valuable renewable energy resource, and therefore every single community is going to have to address energy development in the community. Now, that development needs to occur consistent with the community's priorities, and that can happen. There are ways to do that. But communities, for all these projects to move forward in this renewable energy future to be realized, are least equipped than any other kind of regulatory system in terms of navigating these kinds of developments and these kinds of land uses. I'm an urban planner. That's actually what kind of my urban and land use planner, my training, and in a lot of counties around in rural America, the person who does the zoning also does the solid waste. You know, I mean, they wear multiple hats and they aren't necessarily trained in all this stuff. Communities need assistance in navigating the clean energy future, and we used to have programs like this one that my company helped run, a national program called Energy Ready. It was the only national program that offered clean energy technical assistance and training to every single local government across the nation, free of charge. We'd assisted, actually certified 650 communities across the nation as kind of solar, and we do it both for solar energy and for charging systems like EV charging infrastructure, to certified as being solar or charging ready. We've provided thousands of local governments training, and they have received technical assistance. They've accessed our guidance. We have a network that includes a number of states that have been trying to administer their own programs and goals, and we work with them. Dozens of state-based NGOs and partnerships with the industry. This program was eliminated 3 weeks ago. Leaving a big gap in how we're going to address the kind of barriers we see at the community level in terms of social license. How do we actually help them do this? Where are the resources going to come from? Federal government had been investing in this. Now they're no longer going to show that leadership. And we're trying to currently figure out how we're going to cobble together a system, and we think we can, of state and NGO resources to continue this program. And similarly, the kind of market expansion opportunities that I referenced earlier, community economic opportunity, one of the big things that came out of the Biden administration originally in the IRA was the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which included several programs that were specifically directed at transforming market barriers so that they weren't in the way of expanded use of things like solar energy for low-income households or communities that didn't have very many resources, providing capital at a lower cost for emerging technologies, all those kinds of things. My colleagues from the Center for Rural Affairs, are you guys here? They had a booth. I don't know if they're here. But they were the recipient of the Solar for All program in the state of Nebraska, $62 million that was going to be available to help communities kind of see the benefits directly of this for even their most vulnerable households and businesses. And that has been eliminated. So the kind of concluding thing really is about kind of what we're seeing with retail electric prices and what this means. All these things I'm talking about kind of go to the point that I made early on, which is the investment that we're making in renewables and in technologies and in the grid and in things like battery storage are actually the key to unlocking price reductions in our electric systems. We're seeing significant increases from the last 3 years on electric retail prices. This is, there's been a lot of analysis on this. This is not being driven by clean energy investment, but rather by a lot of grid investment that's being made, because of course most of your retail electric price is actually T&D, it's not generation. The actual amount of dollars being spent by utilities on electric generation has actually been going down. That's renewable energy. And so we continue that, plus we add to it the kind of new technologies that are coming up in our grid. We're going to be able to kind of reduce those prices. So when we think about what our energy resources are and what is American energy, it's really clean energy. Clean energy technologies and programs and investments, regardless of the form it takes and the kind of technologies that we're seeing, are really the way to the future, so that we can actually kind of grow this industry, grow our economy, and lower our electric prices for our consumers from the residential level all the way up to the industrial level. So that's my talk.